Hey guys, welcome back. So I want to get into part 2 of Extreme Carnage with Extreme Carnage Scream Issue 1. And in part 2 of this series, we pick up with more of the details of what Carnage had mentioned to Flash about him recruiting the rest of their family. But also in part 2, we get a bit more information about how Cletus is doing this. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so with Extreme Carnage Scream Issue 1, for this entire issue, we follow the current story of the current Scream, Andy Benton. And to get a better understanding of where she's at recently, I'd heavily recommend for you to check out Planet of the Symbiotes Issue 1, because there's a lot of references to that issue within this issue. And I got a link below if you need to be caught up, because at the time when we talked about Planet of the Symbiotes, we also did a quick little history catch up on Andy Benton as well. So that'll definitely get you caught up before you jump into reading Extreme Carnage Scream. But where we start off here is over at Alchemax Tower, to where for the most part Alchemax is notoriously known for a number of their shady genetic experiments, and when they're not creating something weird, they're probably holding it against his will and experimenting on it. But then it's here where we jump in, where we also find Doppelganger jumping out of the window. And with Doppelganger, the trail that led him to Alchemax, I guess if you start around the time from Absolute Carnage, towards the end of that, he was taken to Ravencroft, and then when Ravencroft was raided by vampires, which I think took place in Jason Aaron's Avengers, but after that happened, he was later apprehended and taken to Alchemax. And now it's here in Extreme Carnage where he's just hey, I can't do it anymore, Alchemax, I'm out. But also with him leaving Alchemax, he's immediately pursued by the Guardians. But as soon as Doppelganger hits the streets and he's fighting off these different Guardians, it's here where he's then spotted by Scream. And in the case of Scream, Andy Benton, since King in Black, or even more so during the time of King in Black, for the most part she's been around in the streets of New York, catching all the loose ends, and really just helping who she could on the ground level, around the outskirts of the main battle, the main event, which eventually led to Eddie Brock defeating Knull. But it's here with Scream where she catches Doppelganger, and she literally stops him from killing this Guardian, but even with doing so, the Guardian calls for backup. But then between her and her symbiote, they kind of go over the idea of what if they flip this to where instead of the Guardians hunting symbiotes, symbiotes were instead hunting for them. And initially she starts to ask this guy why are the Guardians hunting for symbiotes? And all he tells her is that they've been instructed to keep an eye out for non-human activity. And he tells her that's it, that's all you're getting out of me. But for Scream, that's fine by her because she just ends up killing the dude anyway. But really what's been happening here, while Scream was talking to this Guardian, there's also been this thrumming sound that she heard, or more specifically that her symbiote heard, that was coming by a nearby Senator Kane broadcast. And with this happening, Andy, she couldn't hear it, but her symbiote could. So initially Andy just thought her symbiote was getting into politics, but her symbiote then expressed that this thrumming sound was calling her to the family. And with this happening, she was then disoriented, which caused her to back up into the street, and immediately she's hit by a car. And it kind of had me thinking if you're a driver and you're paying attention to the road at least, and you see Scream standing to the side watching an ad or watching a broadcast from the senator at least, that should at least call your attention to either make a U-turn or just take some other detour altogether. But with this whole thing happening and this thrumming sound coming out, which we know from Extreme Carnage Alpha, that this is more or less the sound of Carnage reaching out. But also with this happening, we get a separation between Andy and the Scream symbiote, with the symbiote responding to the call we gotta go, and Andy on the other hand trying to stop the symbiote. And when this happens, Andy, she tries to get the two of them at least somewhere isolated so that they can refocus and more or less resync, so to speak. And because of that, Andy takes the two of them down in the sewer. But after they get down there, suddenly Andy realizes that she's not even in the sewer, but instead she's immediately taken into an illusion, to where in this illusion the symbiote's completely gone, and all of a sudden she's alone in the dark with Carnage. And it's here with seeing this that we find out that Carnage has pulled her into the Hive. And when this happens, we get a little bit more information about how Carnage is doing this, when he tells Andy that it's funny what happens to a kingdom when you dispose of the king, because Knull used to rule this place and now Brock thinks that he does. But then it's also here where Cletus tells her that he was here first and he made this place his home while the storm was blowing over. And with them saying this, it's really just confirmation of what I assumed with the callback to Venom Island. And you can even go as far back as Absolute Carnage, because after Eddie killed Cassidy, who was effectively one with his symbiote, this only killed or re-killed Cassidy's physical body, because Eddie absorbed the Grendel that was keeping that body alive. But this also brought along Cassidy and springboarded into Venom Island, where Eddie borrowed a Quinjet from the Avengers so that him and his other could take Carnage to the Island of Bones, but Carnage made sure they were stranded. but it was also here where Cletus had hijacked the Venom symbiote and giving Eddie the option either to just give up, or Carnage would forcefully just take over his body and make Eddie watch everything through his own eyes with Cassidy in control. Because at the time we were also given the explanation, like with Cassidy dying so many times and him coming back, that he'd learned how to navigate through the Hive much better than most. And really parts of this go back even further, with Cassidy and his symbiote having perfect symbiosis on top of how long they've been in perfect symbiosis. But essentially from Carnage Born throughout Absolute Carnage, and furthermore in Venom Island, we had really been given this arc to where Cassidy, he had been navigating the Hive, and even to the point to where he could use it to pull off new tricks, like imprisoning people and using their bodies. And this is more or less the long and short of what Cassidy is telling Andy when he lets her know that he has more experience in the Hive, and that he was there first in relation to Eddie. And with the way that Cassidy says this, it's like Eddie may think that he's doing something, but he's really just new to all this. Unlike Carnage, who has literally been visiting the Hive since birth. And when he says this, like, first of all, it makes sense, but also it's like Eddie's gotta be careful, man, because with Venom 200 showing us like all the crazy things that Eddie can do, and now Cassidy's pretty much saying that he is to Eddie what Eddie was to Knull. Like, that's the new shift in the kingdom. Because if you think about it, back during the time of King in Black, the reason why Eddie was so dangerous to Knull is because he was the person who had been in the symbiote for the longest, which is what we were told going up to the finale of King in Black, before the Enigma Force dropped in and just made Eddie OP. But prior to that, Eddie's time in a symbiote was like the explanation to why he was such a credible threat to Knull before his power buff. So now that the original King Knull is gone and Eddie has taken his place, Carnage has now taken Eddie's place. But as usual with Carnage, there's many more tricks up his sleeve. And for the time being with Carnage, a lot of these things are things that we've seen him do before. And because of that, his approach towards Eddie is going to be very different than Eddie's approach towards Knull. And I doubt the Enigma Force is coming back inside with Carnage. But with us getting this, it's interesting to see how it'll play out. But with Carnage pulling the Venom Island Hive prison thing that he did with Eddie, like pulling it on Andy now, he then pulls the Venom Island symbiote body takeover on Andy in the Scream symbiote. But even with the Scream symbiote under the influence of Carnage and Andy Benton still in her Hive prison, Andy still has a fighting chance here, even though she hasn't been in the Scream symbiote for that long. But even still with that being the case, she has her experience with the Mania symbiote, which for a host, like, that counts as experience, much how like Rex explained with Eddie and him being in the Venom symbiote for so long. But for the time being on the outside, like the backup Guardians, they've showed up, but when they get there, Carnage is using Scream to just destroy these guys. And it's crazy seeing this happen because Carnage is very much using a combination of Scream's style as well as his own, and it's like these guys don't even stand a chance. But inside the Hive between Andy and the Scream symbiote, and she's trying to tell the symbiote like not to follow Carnage, but the pull from Carnage to the Scream symbiote, like, it's just way too strong. And it's because of this where Andy, she has to go to her last resort and she has to use her Hell Mark, which she had got from Flash back when she first became Mania, and with using this, it'll allow her to burn her way free. But even still, she's cautious with using this because she doesn't want to harm the Scream symbiote, because even prior to now, she's been using the Hell Mark with the Scream symbiote and it didn't harm the Scream symbiote before because Andy was protecting it, and at the time she didn't allow the Hellfire to harm the Scream symbiote because up to this point they were working together, which essentially is the same concept of why when Ghost Rider or any Ghost Rider picks a vehicle, like, it just doesn't melt. Or at least that's the way I've looked at it for the longest, like either with Andy or anyone else who has been temporarily either given the Hell Mark or has used Hellfire at their own discretion. But with Andy doing this and breaking her way free, like, the Scream symbiote, like, it feels it. But effectively, this also allows Andy to regain consciousness, and when she does, immediately Cletus uses this against her, and he tells the Scream symbiote, like, look, I told you, your host is no good and all she's gonna do is try to hurt you. And sadly, like, the Scream symbiote buys into this. And it's not so much because the Scream symbiote just trusts Carnage over Andy, but it's also the fact, like, the influence of Carnage, like, it's heavily skewing the Scream symbiote's judgment. So immediately when Andy regains control of her body, the Scream symbiote starts to choke her out and pull her back in. But then in an act of desperation, Andy just lets off a Hellmark blast, incinerating the Scream symbiote and setting herself free. And with doing so, she gets rid of Cassidy, but she also kills the Scream symbiote. And it's really a bit of a heartbreaking moment. But then as she's here grieving, one of the Guardians then puts his hand on her shoulder. And when this happens, I'm like, man, like, this looks like one of those moments where you just clock out and you let the company take it from there. Because when you see this girl just catch on fire, you just be like, you know what? This looks like a job for management. Let me get out the way. But no, this particular Guardian, he's one of those guys who would just take a bullet for the company. And like, everybody knows that co-worker, like, this dude, like, he takes it He takes his job way more serious than he should, and for that reason, in this moment, he literally catches hell for it, or hellfire for that matter. But when this happens, Andy, she initially screams, "Stay away from us," or "Don't come near us," but then after getting this guy out of the way, she's like, "Leave me alone," because she realizes that she's truly by herself, and the little bit that remains of the Scream symbiote, it's non-responsive. But the other Guardians, they also show up, and they've come to take what's left of the Scream symbiote back with them to Alchemax. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here, who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below or over on Discord, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.